Good morning to all from the editorial board of Build Up Portal. For the ones who are attending a Build Up webinar for the first time, welcome. For our returning audience, thank you for renovating your interest. It is a pleasure to host the second webinar of the EPB Standards series entitled EPB Standards Overview: Why, How, What, which is organized in collaboration with EPB Center and RIVA, Federation of European Heating, Ventilation and Air Conditioning Associations. I would like to invite you all to contribute and participate in this webinar. You can ask questions by typing in the box on the right side of the screen. They will be answered at the end after the presentations. You can also contribute to Build Up Portal. Build Up is a collaborative platform in the field of energy efficiency in buildings. It is continuously updated and it represents one of the key sources of information on the topic of energy efficiency. You can register and become a member of the community, and you can also upload news, events, present a case study, results from a project, and so on. I would like to invite you all to navigate the portal. In the Learn section, you'll find all the podcasts of the past webinars, so it is possible to listen to all the previous presentations. At the end of this webinar, the link to the full presentation and the file to the PDF presentation will be made available. Now I would like to present the agenda and introduce the speakers. First, Jaap Hogeling, Chairperson, CENTC 371 Energy Performance of Buildings Project Group and European Committee for Standardization, who will answer why and talk about EPBD and EPB standards. Then Dick van Dijk, EPB expert and from the EPB Center, will address how and talk about the key features of the EPB standards delivering on their promise. Finally, Andrei Vladimir Litiu, a project consultant from RIVA, will answer what trustable information, online information resources, and tailored services. Now I would like to leave the floor to Jaap Hogeling. So please, we can start the session.
Thank you for your kind introduction. And I want to say a few words to all the listeners who are interested in why do we need these energy performance of building standards to support the implementation of the EPBD, the Directive on Energy Performance of Buildings, and what's the relation to the ongoing EU policy developments on building energy performance. My background is, as said, chairperson from 371, the Energy Performance of Buildings Project Group, a project leader of the mandated work to CEN on development of this set of EPB standards. I participated in the 5 technical committees and at CEN level and 2 at ISO level, all related to energy performance in buildings. And in my background is manager international standards at ISO, the Netherlands, and initiator also of the EPB Center, an initiative from ISO and RIVA, and a fellow of ESRE and RIVA. I want to focus on the last mandate, the mandate 480 to CEN, to support the EPB implementation. CEN got a mandate for elaboration and adoption of the standards for a methodology calculating the integrated energy performance of buildings and promoting the energy efficiency of buildings in accordance to the terms set in the recast EPB from 2010. And to summarize what was in that directive and in the mandate, to set standards that shall be systematic, clear and comprehensive, benefit professionals, EU member states and relations with third countries, have a continuous but modular overall structure enabling a step-by-step implementation by EU member states, and have a balance between accuracy and a level of detail. Also have flexibility, not a size fits all, but harmonized with national choices. And that was also addressed in the first webinar. Follow a holistic approach as a key driver for technological innovation and change. But since 2010, there is even increased urgency on, we all know the Paris Agreement and the target we want to reach of global warming, not 2 degrees, perhaps 1.5 degrees if you are very optimistic. And that resulted in Europe also to revise EPBD in 2018. And I will also refer to that and to Annex 1. And in December, we had the agreement in the EU on the Green Deal. And that is also, our set of standards is also serving this. About the revised EPBD, it was also explained by the Commission in the first seminar, but just to summarize, towards more transparency, look at Annex 1 of this EPBD, and better data on the energy performance of buildings. There's a new obligation to describe national calculation methodology following the national annexes of the overarching standards. And there are considerations for the calculation of the primary energy factors, which are an important driver of the energy performance declaration of buildings. The national calculation methodologies must reflect the energy needs of a building, respecting the indoor environmental quality in buildings. As we all know, people stay for 80% of their times inside buildings, and health cannot be compromised by energy saving measures. Pursuing an optimal energy performance of the building envelope and requirements for EP energy performance certificate databases to reflect the state of art of the buildings in the different member states. The Green Deal also included some issues. Of course, the statement that we are using 40% or a little bit less, perhaps, of all the energy used in Europe for buildings. So to improve buildings is very important. The current renovation rates are too low. They should be doubled. And we should get a better energy performance of buildings. And a strict enforcement of the rules on energy performance of buildings is quite essential as formulated in the Green Deal. So the set of standards we developed under the mandate supports also the Green Deal requirements and program and the EPB implementation in member states. So to summarize, energy efficiency first. This is very important. And then the use of renewable energy has to be addressed in the standards. We have to monitor the nearly zero energy of buildings uptake and cost optimal minimum energy performance requirements that are set by the member states regulators. Reinforce the certification system on energy performance of buildings and make a better database, enhance transparency and consistency in the assessment procedure, and allow flexibility and support by this long-term renovation strategy of the member states towards decarbonization of our building stock by 2050, and an optimal partial energy performance of building envelope and building systems. Transparency and consistency on the use of primary energy factor and CO2 emission factors. That is the goal of the set of standards, and the standards are written in such a way that we can support this. Why we need those harmonized procedures? Harmonization is a process of minimizing the redundance or conflicting standards which may have evolved independently. Well, that is what we presented by developing this set of standards as in one program where we coordinated all the standards in a correct way. Harmonization cuts the compliance cost and simplifies the process of meeting requirements. And that is the purpose of the set of standards. Increase the accessibility and transparency and the objectivity of the assessment procedures for energy performance, and avoid trade barriers for energy-related products and services in Europe and beyond. Adopt the same structure for energy performance assessment procedure, the starting point for national and regional building codes on energy performance of buildings. This is a little bit in history. Looking back, we started in the 80s with simple requirements on buildings and envelope and components, slowly moving in the 90s to also looking at the energy needs. In 2000, based on an earlier mandate, 343, we also included a more holistic approach on the energy use for heating and cooling. And in 2010, we received in CEN this mandate 480, where the overall energy performance of buildings towards energy producing built environment with an interacting grid was included in our task towards nearly zero energy buildings, and further on, of course, to decarbonize the building stock. This is, you could say, history, and the current consistent set of standards to assess the overall energy performance of buildings are there to support on one side the directive, but also to show what is the content of the energy certificate and how to check compliance against minimum energy performance requirements included in the national regulation. Harmonized procedures, but flexible for national situations as a basis to give customized energy advice to renovate existing building stock, because that is really the focus that we should look at. And the holistic approach, as said before, where we go from boundary conditions and product data to energy need and energy use calculations, and finally expressing the energy performance in buildings in a transparent way. The set of standards, 53 standards, to assess the integrated impact on the energy performance of buildings, covering all systems, heating, cooling, ventilation, domestic hot water, lighting, and the impact of building automation and smart controls, also covering energy using and renewable energy producing appliances, and respecting the indoor environmental quality requirements. This set was published 2017-2018, and it is a coherent set that will be also explained later, but it is really a set that works together. The in and outputs are very well defined. And they are, and that's very important, they are flexible to take into account the national legal context, the building tradition, the climate, and the building use. And we address this by an Annex AB approach. The EPB requires member states to express the energy performance in kilowatt hours per square meter per year. This is addressed in our standards, and also encourage the member states to include deconnected greenhouse gas production. The methodology we prepared in the standards is transparent and open for innovation, and Member states shall describe their national procedures if they don't use the standards itself according to these overarching standards. At least these 5 standards have to be respected in the way that they have to report based on the annexes of these standards how their national procedure is working. Flexibility is achieved by having in the standards this Annex A-B approach, and Annex A, where we have a template for choices and input data, an empty table, and an Annex B, where you have an informative default choices and input data that could be used, for example, also for voluntary EU certification systems or other demonstration of how to use the standard. In general, it is expected that choices, levels of simplification and input data related to national building regulations may differ for also different types of buildings, also existing buildings, residential and non-residential will be different in levels of simplifications. For new NZEP buildings, we have more data, so we could have more less simplification. And the use of EPB assessment for deeper innovation towards NZEP also gives some reason to develop for renovation projects special annexes. My conclusion is that this modular, transparent, unambiguous but flexible set of standards is the important instrument to support the proper implementation of the EPBD in the European member states. It's supporting and defining the nearly zero energy approach. It's supporting towards the future the decarbonization of our building stock by 2050. And the flexibility, again, is, of course, to respect local climate, national legal framework on definitions and levels of simplification, building traditions, building use and energy infrastructure, as the building is part of the local grid. A few words on the rollout of this set of standards. We set up this EPB center to give service and information on standards. To say it very short, service for member states, regulators and national standard bodies to complete the national annexes of the overarching standards mentioned before, disseminate information and promote the use of the overarching standards and other EPB standards, and provide information services for all involved stakeholders, such as industry, researchers, engineers, and building professionals, financial institutions that are dealing with EPB standards. So we are there to answer questions on the use of the standards and how to implement them and how to deal with this question around these national annexes. For that, we will have knowledge tools. We are building a community of practitioners. Frequent asked questions you can find on our website, calculation tools, spreadsheet programs for individual standards, case study pools for practical examples tailored to the needs of the stakeholders, workshops and offline training sessions in the near future, and currently, as you listen to now, a webinar series on EPB standards. This all to build a community of practitioners to share knowledge and experience on the use of standards and to support the ambitious uptake of the standards around Europe in the different member states. There is a lot of information available. I just show you here some journals from RIVA. There are more articles in more RIVA journals, but on the EPB Center website, you find a lot of background information, and you can also raise any questions you want towards the use of the standards or the interpretation of the standards, because when you use the standards, you may have questions that need an answer to continue your use of the standard. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you have really are convinced that this set of standards is really to help to implement the EPBD and also to implement further policy measures of the European Union on energy performance in buildings. Thank you again. And this last slide will show you a bright future. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dick van Dijk. And in the next 20 minutes, I will explain more about the setup of the set of EPB standards. I'll first introduce myself shortly. I'm one of the experts at the EPB Center, and I was involved in the initiation, preparation, and coordination of the set of EPB standards when they were developed in the past couple of years. I'm also co-convener of the ISO Joint Working Group, who coordinates the overall set of EN ISO EPB standards at ISO global level in collaboration with CEN. And I'm also convener of another ISO working group that is responsible for a few key EPB standards. For instance, the standard on the energy needs for heating and cooling, the standard on climatic data, and a standard on partial energy performance indicators for the energy needs and the building fabric. Well, when we speak about the overall energy performance of buildings, if you've also seen in the presentation by Jaap, we are dealing with quite a number of different components, ranging from the building and building elements, heating systems, airflows, ventilation system, cooling systems, and several more. So this requires an integrated and modular set of these calculation procedures. So these are just a few pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. And here you see some others. I will not read them all aloud, but there are several which are on the core of the calculation procedures and others which are more on the boundary of the procedures. And you end up with all these pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, and these all need to fit nicely together to form a complete puzzle. And that's what we try to create. And this is the result, a modular set of standards. And this was presented at the first webinar in the 4th of February. And I can imagine that you say, wow, this looks very complicated. So now I'm confused. Yeah, of course, if you look at this kind of schedule for the first time, surely you are confused. But don't worry, we have a short video which explains the overall scheme. It's just a 6 minutes video, and you know much more about the scheme and how to interpret it. And I could add to this that the core of the EPB calculation method consists of only a handful of EPB standards. And I'll explain a little bit more in the next slides. So it's true, the set of EPB standards covers over 50 documents. But these are not only standards on calculation procedures. Several of these standards are on energetic properties of components or products. For instance, if you want to calculate the U value of a window or wall, there are a few standards on that. And these are typically not for use by the practitioner, but these are used by manufacturers or suppliers. They will do the calculations and they will supply the practitioner with the numbers coming from these standards. Then you have also other standards dealing with, for instance, boundary conditions. So take the climatic conditions or the standard conditions of use in the building. So then you have to think about the temperature settings for the different types of buildings and spaces, or ventilation requirements. And again, these are usually not to be dealt with by the practitioners, but these are fixed by the national regional regulators. So you only, as a practitioner, need to know the output. And finally, you have a number of EPB standards which are on special topics. For instance, guidance on inspection of systems, or economic evaluation procedures, or system requirements like requirements for the design or the sizing of a system, and also on measured energy performance, which is important also in the context of getting a reliable energy performance. Then you have also standards on which contain reference procedures. So they form the basis for other EPB standards which are for more practical use. So we can conclude that the set of EPB standards includes many standards that are not needed for practitioners when they want to assess the energy performance of a specific building. Actually, there are 5 EPB calculation standards, and you might recognize this small pyramid that Jaap also showed. So let me start at the very top. Actually, the whole set of standards is guided by the EN ISO 52000 Part 1, the overarching EPB standard. This standard comprises the EPB framework. So it contains common terms for all the EPB standards, a modular structure. But it also gives you the rules to calculate the overall energy performance. And to get to the overall energy performance, you need to collect all the energy uses from the systems. And then you have to convert these to primary energy and CO2 emissions. So as I said, that standard requires the use of standards on the energy use. These are actually several standards dealing with the different services, ventilation, heating, cooling, lighting, and so on. And then many of these standards are subdivided in different parts, covering different subsystems or components, or very special systems like heat pumps or combined heat and power. Well, in order to be able to calculate the energy use for these services, you have to know the energy needs. And one of the important energy needs, of course, is the energy needs for heating and cooling. And this is covered in EN ISO 52016 Part 1. But again, to calculate the energy needs, you need to know the boundary conditions. You need to know the component product characteristics, which I mentioned before. So one of the key standards there is EN ISO 52010 Part 1 on climatic conditions. Then at the right-hand side, you see 2 more standards. These are, you could say, post-processing standards. So first, EN ISO 52003 Part 1, that's a standard which gets the overall energy performance from the overarching standard here. And it gives rules to apply to get to overall indicators or to ways to describe the energy performance requirements or to the energy performance ratings and labels. Then, equally important is EN ISO 52018 Part 1. That gives you the partial indicators of the building fabric and the energy needs. And this is something which is important also in the context of the new EPBD that explicitly requires you to minimize the energy needs at the building level. So, moreover, these are detailed calculation procedures. That's true, but in practice, if you have detailed calculation procedures, you use software tools in which all the algorithms are embedded. So for practice, you don't need to worry about all the details of these calculation procedures. And moreover, the number of input data is not proportional to the complexity of the calculation method. And just as a tip, the webinar in May 26 will deal with the hourly versus the monthly calculation method. And there it will be shown that for the hourly calculation method, you don't even need more input data than you normally use for the simplified monthly method. So the number of input data is not proportional to the complexity of the calculation method. And also, if you look at the number of input data, most of the input data are on the building envelope. So how to get to the U value of your windows, of your walls, of the roof and your floor. So this is, you could say, nothing new, because since the 70s of the last century, we have these standards which deal with the overall thermal insulation level of a building and similar aspects. So this is quite traditional requirement to have all this input data. And what is very important to take into account here is that in the standard which deals with the building and building envelope, you have zoning rules, but these zoning rules can be tuned at national level. So you could have in your country very detailed rules to divide the building into different thermal zones, like different zones for the different functions of the spaces, or different zones depending on the orientation of the spaces. Well, and of course, the more thermal zones you have divided for your building, the more complex it becomes to assess the areas and the U values of all the elements in the building envelope. But if you are in a country where it was decided at national level that you could do with less precise detailing of the building, so a more global approach with respect to the thermal zoning, then you could, for instance, just have data per facade, that you could collect all the data of the windows and the facade combined, and that would mean much less input data. And then, of course, a number of product data are put into databases, and that is an increasing amount, and will also increase in the future. You heard the term ISO 52000 a few times already. So all the new or strongly revised EPB standards, which were developed in the years 2012 to 2015 at global level, at ISO level, are a member of the new ISO 52000 family. So these are the international standards on the energy performance of buildings using the holistic approach. So the ISO 52000 family is becoming a strong brand name. And why is that? That's because you have in this family the overarching framework, the EN ISO 52000 Part 1. You have common quality requirements for all the standards. You have rules to ensure overall consistency between the individual standards. So for instance, if you need, as one of the EPB standards, output from another standard as an input to your standard, then it is ensured that you have a good match between the output and the input. Output from another standard, input for your standard. And common format is used for all these EPB standards. And the set of EPB standards, especially the ISO 52000 family, are managed by a multidisciplinary international team of experts, which consists of experts from the ISO committees and the CENT committee mentioned here, with contributions from sister committees which represent specific disciplines. One of the quality requirements for all the EPB standards and also for the ISO 52000 family is that you have an accompanying technical report for each standard or each cluster of standards. There you can find the explanation and justification and examples for the calculation. You also have a spreadsheet for each of the calculation standards, which is used for validation of the calculation procedures and contains worked examples. And often these worked examples can be found in the technical reports as examples. So there's one frequent misunderstanding that we need to address. So we hear people say, I don't believe in a one-size-fits-all method for such a diversity of countries within Europe, but also at global level, even more at global level. Well, Jaap already said in his presentation, the EPB standards are far from a one-size-fits-all approach. Of course, the EPB standards are standards, so the approach is harmonized, but there's flexibility to tailor it to the national situation. So there are many options to tailor to national regional situation. I will not go into the details because Jaap already explained some of these. And also you can see the recording of the webinar which we held on February 4th, and you find much more details on this. Another frequent misunderstanding. In the EPB standards, I can't find the EP requirements. I find only calculation procedures, but not the requirements like the minimum values for efficiency or the maximum overall energy performance. Well, that's correct, and that's because the EPB standards, they provide the methods and the scales. But the regulations, national, regional, or transnational regulations, they give you the requirements and the limits based on these scales. And another tip, at the third webinar, the next webinar on April 16, the focus is on these scales. So how the calculation methods relate to the EP indicators, requirements, and rating. That's a very fascinating subject, and we encourage you to register for the website for the webinar next webinar, which you can do on the Build Up site or on the EPB Center website. I mentioned flexibility. The flexibility also applies to references to other EPB standards. So if you have a specific EPB standards, you have references to other standards to get the input from. But it's allowed to reference to a specific national standard. Of course, that standard should also give the output that you need for your EPB standard. So it should fit in the modular system to some extent. But it allows you as a country to have a step-by-step implementation of the whole set. So start with the most important standards and continue to the others. And so you don't have to adopt the whole set of EPB standards at once. And it also gives you room for special national considerations, which might be special national technologies that are used in the country, or other aspects. So is it all really that simple? Well, of course, life is not that simple. When we're looking at nearly zero energy buildings, they ask for novel technologies, and they should be designed, operating, and interacting correctly under time varying low energy use conditions. So this is a challenge, and such a challenge cannot be avoided. You have to have a specific level of expertise to design a nearly zero energy building. And as I said, you may want to use or need to use specific technologies to come to a nearly zero energy building. And then you need also special standards on these special techniques, which might be a little bit more complex than as I might have shown to you before. On the other hand, the more complex you're building, the more complex the calculations will probably be, because you have more technologies involved in complex buildings, and also, of course, you have more input data. On the other hand, you should be careful, because a simple building to be designed to be brought at nearly zero energy building level may not be that simple after all. So I come to the conclusion that the set of EPB standards to assess the energy performance of buildings, it's a harmonized, transparent and consistent set, flexible to tailor to national climate, building tradition and legal framework, modular, allowing step-by-step implementation, and also modular because that enables a regular maintenance and updating to new knowledge and technologies. It's fit for nearly zero energy buildings, both new buildings and renovated. There's a small core of standards with others for specific special applications. And I've explained to you the EN ISO 52000 family with its common quality requirements. Well, I can imagine that you learned something from this presentation, but I can also imagine that even if you are more familiar with the subject, like on the EPB standards or regulations, you probably still have many questions, which may even range from what is actually the EN ISO or ISO, what are links with the EPBD. Maybe you have more technical questions on individual standards. Please check the frequently asked questions section at the EPB Center website, and you can also contact us by filling in the contact form at the website. So this concludes my presentation, and I thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about the why, how, and what of the EPB standards, and being third in line. So I will be the one talking more about the what, so the actual EPB standards. I didn't prepare a slide about myself, but please connect with me on LinkedIn, and then we can either find some issues to, let's say, go into further depth in terms of the EPB standards and explore any possible emerging synergies, and yeah, stay connected. And basically that's something that I will cover in my presentation, how you can stay connected with all the topics that have been covered by Jaap and Dick in the previous presentations. I will only say about myself that I'm currently working for Riva as a project consultant, and being a building services engineer with a few years of actual practice as designer and installer. It gives me great pleasure to see how these standards can facilitate this transition to sustainable built environment. And honestly, I would have loved to have them in university during my studies, and even more when I was actually working, so designing actual buildings and going inside them when they were being constructed and all the systems installed. But yeah, it's just a question of timing. So the standards are now here. As some of you already know, these standards can be purchased via the national standardization body within your country, or maybe access can be bought with, depending on the country. However, the EPB Center is meant to provide you guidance on how to actually implement them, because as you have seen from the presentations of both Jaap and Dick, there are many benefits to be reaped by implementing these standards EU-wide. So I'll be going briefly together with you through the online information resources available, then ending on the tailored services with the ultimate scope of having this being used by all building sector stakeholders. So anybody that has remote link to building performance, to building construction, they have something to gain from using the EPB standards. I'll briefly start with the social media. I will not go directly on the channels because this is something that most of us are familiar with. It's a very, I would say, intimate experience that by now all of us have gone through. But I just prepared here the links, so the EPB Center can be directly accessible via the Twitter account, and on LinkedIn we have the EPB Standards community, and this is a place for communication, dissemination, and exploitation of all initiatives that are related to the EPB standards. And some of you, I'm sure, are already members. And as you have seen, or you will see once you join, there are all sorts of, I would say, complementing activities from Horizon 2020 projects that are being discussed there within that group. And that's the scope to have a live discussion and continuously improve everything that we are doing by using these EPB standards. However, we need to also be available on other medias, so we also publish content via Riva's account. As Jaap already mentioned, EPB Center is an initiative of ISSO and Riva, so we facilitate the Riva network as we cover building professionals across Europe. We estimate around 120,000. So one option is the Riva Facebook. So also there you can find information about the EPB Center and the EPB standards in general. So you don't need to create another account if you're already on Facebook and prefer that. And as already mentioned, we have all sorts of video material. So also there we take advantage of Riva's YouTube channel. So you have here the links. Before I jump to the website, because as any organization, EPB Center also has the website as the main interface. I would just want to highlight that you can have a very visually interactive overview of the set of EPB standards. So the 50 documents that Dick was referring to in his presentation. And then if you want to go in more depth, you can go on the EPB Center website, and I will show you in a second on both of these websites how the experience is. And again, as highlight, we are within the scope of our activities. We are developing very short videos. We call them self-explanatory videos titled the EPB Standards Explained, and we are covering several topics that are very relevant for everything that's happening in this EU-level transition to a decarbonized, a sustainable building stock. And we've already produced a couple. We have 3 now in the final stage, so soon will be released. So also if you want to be kept up to date on these ones, and furthermore, if you have proposals for some videos that you would like to see, that's also something that it's worth communicating to the EPB Center's expert to discuss and see how we can address the needs, the actual needs. So now the website, in social media, as you know, you are exposed more in a bite-sized chunks of information, more regular, I would say, more often. However, via the EPB Center, you can also register to the newsletter, and there, if you prefer to receive updates via email rather than social media, that's also another option, or just go on the website itself. So now I'll just quickly show you the overall set of standards, how they look. Let's see how this goes. So as I said, on Riva's webpage, we have a very interactive overview, so to say, with lots of colors. So it's interesting to go through this just to have the overall picture of the standards. And they are split in three main groups, so to say. You have the overarching ones. And as soon as you click on one of them, you immediately get a pop-up with more information. Of course, that's the depth of details that you can go to, so not more. Then you can go to the building as such. And here you see all the sub-modules and the standards developed to address them. And then the last level, you have the technical building systems, the TBSs. And as you can see, they are very nicely dealt with in a holistic way, as Jaap and Dick already shared with you. So that's the very, I would say, interactive visualization. And as I said, you can get more detailed information by clicking, but that's it in terms of level of depth. But then, of course, you can go on the EPB Center website. And here, I would say you have all the information that's currently available about the set of EPB standards. You can browse. I encourage you to have a go and look for the information you're most interested in. And of course, everything that we are promoting on social media can also be accessed via the website. As I said, you can register to the newsletter or via the news items. But then if you want to go in specific details on some of the standards, you can select the module you are interested in, and let's say maybe you want to see the overarching ones for the calculation procedures. And here, as soon as you go into further depth, you have direct access to the frequently asked questions. You can see some erratas, and then you find links to all the documents. So all the overarching standards, and here you have the links. And in addition, you also have the calculation spreadsheets attached to these documents. And then if you are to click on, let's say, the overarching one, then you go even further. You have an abstract, of course, the video that Dick already included in his presentation. And furthermore, you have articles that have been published so far on that specific topic. So the experience is the same for any of the standards. The scope of the website is to collect all the available information and somehow store it in a centralized way so that you can easily access it and start benefiting from this set of standards. Now, if I go back to the presentation, so I'll stop here with the website. I encourage you to go and have a go yourself. And of course, another means of conveying more, let's say, easily understandable information, because of course the standards, if you look at them, they appear complex, but in principle they are very simple, and their goal is clear now, as Jaap highlighted. The why is very clear, And it's good that now they are here, especially with the EU Green Deal and all the financing that will be now mobilized for the renovation wave. So if this is to be done, it needs to be done properly so that these buildings will actually perform in practice, and the EPB standards can do this. And such information we are conveying via this webinar series on Build Up. You can also find the videos via the Build Up YouTube channel, directly on the portal. You have the landing registration pages that you have seen. Also, the recordings will be made available there. And also on our website, on the EPB Center. And we managed for the second webinar to already have the registration link ready for the third webinar to be held on the 16th of April. So you have the links available here. And I didn't want to actually put anything in writing in terms of specific services, but as you can imagine, because there are so many stakeholders, because the construction sector, the building sector is in a way fragmented today, that the services that the EPB Center provides are not really like a menu. So we can have, and this is something that we are developing now as we speak, to develop an offering of services that are somehow basic, that could be accessed by all stakeholders. But then if you are a financial institution, if you are a manufacturer, if you are a national standardization body or policymaker, regulator at national level, then of course your needs are very specific. So that's something that we have in the EPB Center. We have this possibility with the experts that we group within the activities, and via the EU-wide network of Riva, one of the founders of EPB Center, to provide you tailored services, and not only in English but also in national language as needed. So this is something that can be accessible. It's something that we are looking for also questions from your side as stakeholders. So if you are interested, please use the contact form, or contact us via LinkedIn, or whatever channel is most convenient for you, or just pop an email to us, and then we can take the discussion further. So that's in a nutshell what I wanted to present to you today. So how you can address the actual standards via which channels. So answering the what part, so the actual standards, how do you actually benefit of them, and you can receive guidance, so to say, tailored to your specific needs, irrespective of the point in the value chain of the building sector that you are located. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so this was the end of the presentation. Thank you to all our speakers. Before starting with the Q&A, I would also like to remind you again about the next webinar. So Build Up already published the event for the next webinar, which is entitled "How to Use the Outputs of the EPB Assessments in Regulation," and is scheduled for the 16th of April at 12. So please go check out the event and click on the registration link. So we can start with the questions. First question is for Jaap. Should the annexes A filled in by the different countries be made available publicly? Is there a website where to find them?
Yes, it's a good question. The annexes are, of course, has to be filled in at the national level, where you have to decide on which boundary conditions, which levels of simplifications you want to address for different types of buildings in your building regulation. So they are developed on national level or regional level. And we have an example of how one country did it, Italy. We also developed a guide how to handle this process of making these national annexes. And if you encounter any problems, feel free to approach us to see if we can be of any assistance. And but I think I can first advise you to look at the guide we developed. You can download from our website, and an example that is based on the draft national annexes that have been developed in Italy.
Okay, so I got some more questions for you. Another one is, could you please briefly describe which stakeholders were involved in the development of the standards?
Well, as many of you may know, that standards developed in CEN, the CEN committees have working groups where the technical experts are working together. The experts are nominated by the national standard bodies. Their background is very diverse, from designers, from industry representatives, from practitioners dealing with systems, dealing with building design, but also researchers and academia, and also representatives from policymakers and regulators. So it was a quite diverse group, different working groups that prepared the technical documents, the standards, and finally it is of course up to the national standard bodies to vote on it and to accept the standards. But you could say that around, if you count it all up, the 5 different TCs with the different working groups and all the people involved on national level to in national mirror groups, I estimate about 500 people looked at it around Europe and give their feedback and contributed to the production of the standards.
Okay, I got another question. I think it's for all of you. Is there any platform which we can access the national implementation of EPBD in the context of indoor environmental quality?
It's just when you address indoor environmental quality, you address one specific standard that is in the set of EPB standards on indoor environmental quality. And it's then about the, if you want to see how countries address this, you should look at the national or annexes or the documents they prepared in the regulation concerning the indoor environmental quality requirements that should be a basis for the energy calculations. Until now, I'm not sure, but perhaps Dick knows if it is already a part of the example we published from Italy. But I know that some countries are working hard to prepare documents based on this indoor environmental quality standard, which show how which data they use for the energy calculations for the indoor environment. So we hope to receive those examples, and as soon as we have them, we will publish them.
Another question, are there some training schemes on these sets of standards?
It's at this moment not on our EPD center service level, but perhaps Andre, you could answer this question because I know there are actions in cooperation with the sensor program.
Yes, thank you very much, Jaap. Yes, indeed, that's a very good question. And as I mentioned on the LinkedIn group, the EPB standards community, those of you that are already members, you have seen most likely information about the CENSE project, so CEN, like the European Committee for Standardization, and CE Certified Expert. And this is a Horizon 2020 project that will finalize this year, by the end of this year. And for now, it covers 17 out of the 50 standards. So yes, training will be available already as of later this year. And we have via the CENSE project an online pilot testing. So if you're interested, especially now during these times, so this is something online, you don't need to travel anywhere. Please go on CENSE website and submit your interest, and then we'll keep you posted. So it should start in the coming month, so in April, the online pilot training, and you will get a hands-on approach on a selection of EPB standards for which training material has been developed.
Thank you. So let's go on with the other questions. A question for Dick. Is the software tool available? And if not, how can we use the EPB standards in practice?
That's a very also a very interesting question, which we get a lot. Well, to give the short answer, there's no overall software tool that covers the whole set of EPB standards. The good news, however, is that there are spreadsheets for each individual standard. So if you want to know more about how an individual standard works, then you can use this spreadsheet. And currently in the EPB standard, we are updating spreadsheets and also seeing if we can connect specific spreadsheets on core standards to be able to make a more complete calculation, covering more aspects than just an individual standard. But so as I said, there's no overall software tool. There are discussions going on in which way we could serve the countries and other stakeholders in supplying or developing and supplying a software tool. The bottleneck, I guess, is that we have a wide variety of countries which each have different choices in the calculation method. So if you want to have an overall tool, you have first to make a decision whether you intend to cover all these options for all the countries and say, okay, this is the tool for covering the standards. And by the way, in that way, if you go into that direction, probably another bottleneck is how to maintain such a tool for all the options and new developments that you have. But another choice could be that you develop a software tool that covers the mostly used options. For instance, there are some countries who have chosen or are choosing a monthly calculation method, and then okay, you could focus your software tool on that. Others have a specific choice for the hourly calculation method, so you could have a second line on that. But again, these are still discussions going on. And in the meantime, of course, there are some countries who are developing their own national calculation tools, software tools. So yes, it's something which, so I said already, it's a very good question. It's something which we probably will not be able to solve at very short notice, but it has and needs our attention, and so we hope with suggestions and resources from whatever side to be able to make a big step in the near future, because indeed it would be very beneficial if we could serve the countries with a software tool as I sketched.
I would go on with another question for you. How do the EPB standards take into account innovation?
Well, yeah, sometimes you hear that in innovation and standards there are two conflicting things, because in standards you describe everything in detail, and if you have an innovation you can't you don't recognize yourself in these standards because they are not prepared for that. Well, there's one solution for that, and we have some of the EPB standards are built in that way, that you have performance requirements instead of performance on what should be the accuracy of the method and what should the method cover, instead of a full description of the method. And if you have a performance description of the method, you can apply a method that takes into account innovative techniques. But there's also a continuous process of updating the standards. All the standard ISO standards are subjected to a periodic review every few years. And then the question is set out to all the stakeholders in the world. Well, do you see a need for a revision of the standards, for an update? So that's one important mechanism to be able to take into account innovations. And one very important aspect is that we spoke about the standards as the methods. Then you have the national or transnational requirements, and that's what I call the innovation motor. That if you have your standards as a method, you set requirements, and so in practice, in the design of the building, people are trying to meet these requirements in the most effective way. So they come up with cheaper solutions, and these are the innovations. They are not yet covered in the standards, so they call upon the ISO and CEN community, please help us in incorporating these innovations. So these innovations are then incorporated, which makes it possible to make the requirements more strict, more closely to what we need in the future, and that's the innovation motor. So I would say in innovation and standards, although it sounds as two conflicting things, they are actually reinforcing things.
Is there scope for consultancy services from across the EU to help with development of resources for dissemination of EPB tools?
I'm not totally understanding the question.
Let's see if we can get another a rephrase of the question from the asker. Let's see. In the meantime, I can go on with another one. So is it true there is an additional EPB standard being now developed for primary energy factors?
Yes, I could answer that. That is true. There is currently a PREN, so draft standards 17423, which standard provides a transparent framework for the reporting on the choices related to the procedure to determine primary energy factors and CO2 emission factors for energy delivered to and exported by buildings as described in the overarching standard ISO, EN ISO 52000. This standard is specifying the choices that to be made to calculate these factors and related to the different energy carriers for exported energy and for delivered energy. In the current overarching standard 52000-1, we have a table of default table with default values of those factors, and that's but we don't give a real strong framework on what choices are beyond these values, and this standard wants to cover this gap so that it becomes transparent which are the choices related and the procedures to the procedure to determine these values. As these values are very important because these are the values you use to multiply your energy performance calculated finally. And so if your factors are too, as you could say, too positive or too high or too low, then it has a big impact on your energy performance declaration in the framework of CO2 emission and the use of primary energy sources. But we'll see, this standard is in process. I hope that after this summer or in the summer, we are able to publish it for a final vote.
Okay, so we have the previous questions have been rephrased. Thank you. Does EPB Center outsource consultancy services to help develop standards and resources? Are there panels of consultants to do work such as this?
Yes, well, the EPB Center has a certain task in the framework of the service contracts of the European Commission. But if we go beyond that task, we are, as an entity, we are able to take consultancy work to support parties who are interested in specific tools or specific services around the application of the standards. This is also the background of the service contract. In the service contract we have with the European Commission, which runs for 3 years, it is said that we also should develop the structure of the EPB Center in such a way that we can continue our services on an in a feasible way. So we have to welcome clients who want to have some special service.
Let's go on with another one. So this is for still for YAP, yes. What was different in M480 compared to M343?
Well, the first mandate, I only touched it very shortly, was the basis for the first generation of EPB standards. So that have been published before 2010, so in around between 2000 and 2010. It was a more limited task to guide the different technical committees to cover all issues on energy performance in their standards. But the really overall coordination between the different technical committees was very limited. So finally, the result was that we had standards from the different technical committees on on building thermal properties of buildings and on, let's say, on ventilation systems, on air conditioning systems, on heating systems, that described parts of the calculation of the assessment of the energy performance, but didn't really fit together in a proper way. So the real holistic approach was missing. And in the second mandate, 480, we got a bigger task and more resources to guide the experts of the different TCs to develop the standards according to some basic documents. We developed 2 technical specifications, how all the standards should look like, the same format, the same definitions, and the same structure, so that they really fit together as a puzzle. And as also explained by Dick in his presentation.
Okay, so another question. Please illustrate what services could EPB Center provide to a building technology manufacturer?
Well, if it is in a manufacturer of a certain technology, I could imagine that we could help this client with the good guidance how to use the standards the standards we developed to demonstrate the performance of this technology in the overall energy performance assessments of buildings. For example, if you have a certain technology and it is not directly described in our standards, I can imagine that you need a supporting document, perhaps a software tool that could help the user of the standard to apply the standard for this certain specific technology. So it's and the advantage could be that the way this technology or the way the European standards are used in the different countries could be more harmonized by providing such a guidance from at the level of the EPB Center dissemination level, because then this information is accessible throughout Europe or beyond.
Okay, so let's go on with another one. Do the EPB standards go beyond the building, for example, grids, networks? Meaning, do they cover demand-side flexibility?
Well, we have, of course, to be careful with this. We address issues on grid interaction, especially with one of our videos about exported energy, how to deal with that. So in the overarching standard, we describe how to deal with import and export of energy. And we also address this in a special video that you can find on our website. And also in the current discussion on the SRI, the Smart Readiness Indicator, and the future development of this SRI, it is an issue we will address in the coming months and years, as I expect. But that is also depending a little bit on the development in Europe on the acceptance of this Smart Readiness Indicator as a tool to show how interactive your building can be in relation to the energy grid.
Okay, so I got some more. How are the standards taking into account feedback from the market?
Well, the market, the question is a little bit what sort of market, but it's we are open for any feedback. So if anybody or any interest groups or a professional association or industrial association has an observation about the use of the standard in the field of EPB, we are open for communication about this, and we are also open for feedback in the way that we could report to the different CEN technical committees if some standards need to be updated or corrected because of difficulty certain stakeholders find in using the standards. So we consider ourselves as a sort of intermediary between, you could say, the market and the CEN technical committees. Of course, you can also send your comments to your national standard body about the standard, but then it's perhaps less focused, and it will take some time, longer time to address the right working groups or experts to address this question. But we are in direct contact with the key experts that prepared the standards and that worked on the standards and that work in the different technical committees. So we have you could say, a faster route to communicate with the technical committees who are responsible of maintaining the standards on CEN and ISO level.
Okay, so maybe another question for Dick. Is it true that the EPB standards are mainly relevant in Europe?
Well, it's true that at this moment, the full set of EPB standards are European standards, so the EN standards. But a number of the key standards, including the overarching EPB standard, most of those are in the ISO 52000 family. They have been developed in CEN and ISO, so in Europe and at global level, so they are available at the global level for the whole world. But there's a difference between what we need in Europe and outside Europe. In Europe, these standards are often asked for by European directives, and in this case, this is also the case, as we've heard today. And at ISO level, the standards are more regarded, so outside Europe, as voluntary procedures. So then it's up to to private parties to use or not to use these standards. So they're not so they have not the tradition to use the standards in their regulation. But having said that, as I said, the brand name of the ISO 52000 family is very is getting stronger and stronger. So there are more and more countries also outside Europe who are translating these standards and are advocating the use of these standards also for their national building regulations. And I said in ISO it's only a limited set, but an increasing number of European standards in the EPB package are now being converted to EN ISO standards, so to become available soon also at ISO level. Those are standards on heating systems, for instance, and on building automation and control.
Okay. Well, we are approaching the end, so I would stop here. I would like to thank again the speakers and the audience for attending this webinar. And I also would like to invite you all again to the next one, which will be held on the 16th of April. So thank you again.